This is Nathan from the Star Trek Continuum mod team again, back for the second video in the old to new HOD conversion demonstration. I have here all of the TGA files after finishing working on them. I didn't mention before that they needed to be 32-bit uncompressed TGA files, not just 32-bit. That's very important. I have also here for the thruster textures. Previously, it was on and off diffuse and an on and off glow only. Here you need the norm, stripe, and team again. I just have them as just black and purple for the norm, so that they're blank essentially. And diff is the same as normal. Diff X, that's DIF X, is the equivalent for the old underscore off, and Glox, GLOX, is the equivalent for the off glow texture. So I use 3ds Max for the conversion because I couldn't wrap my head around Blender, and just going to go and import my flagship. The object file was exported from the HOD before. We have our collision mesh and our shield. Shield is going to be specific to Star Trek Continuum. There might be a few other mods out there that use something similar, but I'm not familiar with how all of them go about doing that. So, need to make sure that you do not import it as a single mesh, and you have retriangulate polygons selected. Texture coordinates need to remain, and don't import the smoothing groups. You need to have the auto smooth going because it looks a bit terrible if you keep the old smoothing groups. Everything else should be pretty much right. I make sure that the unit stays at meters because the ships are scaled to meters. Even the guys who wrote Star Trek tended to use the metric system. Kudos to them. But yes, keeping everything consistent is important, because if you have something inconsistent and you try and rescale it, it can be very, very messy. So we'll import that there. Make sure it's all centered when you select the various bits and pieces. This is your move thing up here. So X, Y, and Z down the bottom. It's very tiny, don't know if you can read it, but they're all showing 0. So I didn't accidentally shift that when I imported it. So I like to work with a perspective of realistic, and you can use this little thingy up the top to move the model around. So that's all come through fairly nicely. We use a script which was written by EchoRed and published on the Gearbox forum for doing all the various bits and pieces of the mod. So I go in, I run the Homeworld Remastered Index tools. We've got 1.1. I don't think there's a newer version. And I just shift that down the bottom there. Okay, so it's not very stable. So try and make sure you don't click on anything unless you're doing something that's specifically related to needing to have something selected. So I make sure I don't have anything selected by clicking on this gray area here, and I go to ship template. Now, the ship template will allow you to have things sort of put into the right branches. So then you can pick up your first mesh and you hit LOD 0. And that's all you need for that. So you've got that there. So this joint is a little useless. I don't know why it's there. So I grab that mult, which I believe is multi-mesh, but yeah. So the rest of it, otherwise, unless you want a whole bunch of these individual little joints, I go through and I rename manually. There's nothing else done to it. The name is just changed. Now, one thing that is not done is adding in the tags. Now, most people would want scars appearing on their ships as they're fired at. So you want underscore tags in capitals, and then a square bracket, DoScar. DoScar is camel case, so capital D, capital S. So then I copy the second half of that. It doesn't matter if you have this tag on every single thing, even the thruster, because HODOR picks out what shows scars as it's doing its compilation. So once you've done that, move those all onto the root. Okay, next is the collision mesh. We have two, so I'll import the collision mesh. It's one mesh here, but if you are reusing this this mesh with 5 or 6 parts to it, you can then tick this import as a single mesh. It'll ruin any texture coordinates which are on it, but that's irrelevant because the collision mesh is not actually visible. So we'll import that and select it, and then click on collision mesh. Now, we've got one more collision mesh in Star Trek Continuum, the shield. This is strictly for how we've got things set up and may not be applicable to you. So there's the shield there. Now, this is where this joint can be useful because we have the shield moving when it collapses so that the collision mesh goes out of the way. So we'll copy this name here and call it Col Shield. And we'll move that down onto this here. If you leave it in here, then it's not actually sitting on that joint and it isn't moved when it needs to be. If you hit the little light bulb here, it'll hide the thing there. Now, last thing to do with the mesh is to make sure you reset the Xform. This makes no sense to me at all. So it's just something that is demanded of by HODOR. So I'll go and reset that. Oh, to get to it, you select the mesh and you choose the hammer, the utilities up in the corner here. You hit reset Xform and reset selected. So go through and do that on every single mesh. Excuse me while I click. And then you go to this blue sort of rainbow thing where it's got the tooltip of modify, and you right click where it has Xform in the modifiers list and you hit collapse all. And then you do that for all of the bits and pieces. Now sometimes you have a mesh that just is going in the wrong direction entirely after it's been put into a HOD. This is the stage where you can check to see if you're going to have any trouble with that. So if we have our collision mesh showing, you can go to this hierarchy here, which is the 3 boxes under the one big box icon, and you can hit this affect pivot only. So I don't know if you can see it very well, but there's a green, a red, and a blue arrow. If that blue arrow is pointing out towards the front of your mesh, then that is a good thing. So you can click on each of those and see, yeah, they're all pointing in the right direction. That means that if we choose Z as up for the export to the DAE, then everything should line up properly, unless I somehow manage to bugger it up during the process. Okay, so I'll hide the collision mesh again, collapse that joint shield there, and I will save my flagship. because you don't want to lose your progress. All right, so that is the first step of getting it into a HOD. Tune in next time for getting the textures all onto the mesh.